Dean Lawrence circulated to kind of whet the appetite of the people on the panel was the following question that caught my eye. Given increased student demand for professional education and STEM fields in the last 5 to 6 years, what is the role for the arts and humanities in 21st century college education? Well, in case you don't keep up with the acronym, STEM means science, technology, engineering, and math, right? So we can rephrase the question. Given the fact that students want more technical classes and more STEM-related majors, is there work left for the liberal arts to do at Augustana College? Should an increased focus by our students on STEM majors mean less focus on the liberal arts? Well, my answer is absolutely not. Positively not. It would be the worst thing we could ever do. For at least 2 reasons. One, liberal arts majors are important in their own right? Even if it could be demonstrated, and I believe this cannot be demonstrated, even if it could be demonstrated that, say, a poetry class had no bearing on the education of a scientist, poetry would still be worthy of the attention of a life. But there's more to be said here. I believe, and my colleagues at Augustana in the Science Division believe, that the liberal arts and humanities are essential parts of educating the next generation of STEM professionals. As a scientist who is interested in the history of science, I can't help but see the question as a little bit ironic. I mean, after all, biology, geology, geographers, those scientific disciplines only recently got invited from the kids' table up to the big kids' table of college and university curriculum. It wasn't that long ago that there were no science requirements outside of math in most colleges and universities. The proposition of requiring science was hotly debated in the 19th century. Of what value in an education would it be to learn science? And so I thought it would be fun to look back at some of the arguments that folks used in the 19th century to justify science education requirements. And it turns out that those arguments actually have interesting things to say about the relationships between the STEM fields and the liberal arts. I'm going to take arguments from Thomas Henry Huxley. You've probably heard of Huxley as Darwin's bulldog, right? The pugnacious defender of all things Darwinian. But you might not know that Huxley was also a dedicated crusader for curricular reform. And the issue he cared about the most was science education. Right? So Huxley is constantly arguing with his colleagues that science needs to be included in the curriculum. The 2 arguments I picked out that I want to look at today. One, Huxley argues that science education will lead us to see the beauty of nature in a way that we wouldn't see it without science education. It's an interesting argument. His second argument is that an education needs to provide a complete theory of life. And we can't have a complete theory of life without the sciences. And to Huxley, a complete theory of life includes knowledge about the possibilities and limitations of our knowledge. I'll look at both arguments here. First, his argument about beauty. Huxley says that we want to teach science, quote, because it would lead us to seek the beauty of natural objects instead of trusting to chance to force them on our attention. To a person uninstructed in natural history, his country or seaside stroll is a walk through a gallery filled with wonderful works of art, 9/10 of which have their faces turned toward the wall. Well, Huxley's right in this. I've spent a lot of time at our field station, Green Wing Environmental Lab, and I've seen students see bugs and dirt at the beginning of their field trip and see beauty at the end of it. So I know Huxley's on to something here. But I think Huxley's argument applies equally well for why science students need the liberal arts. Science students without serious engagement with the arts and humanities are condemned to a depauperate aesthetic. Can you imagine the vast cultural landscapes that have their faces turned to the wall to students who've never seriously studied music or never seriously studied a culture or a language other than their own. I would argue that we simply cannot afford to train physicians and engineers so narrowly that they're unable to appreciate the beauty of the world around them. Huxley's second argument. He says that an object of education is to teach students about culture. And he says that culture implies the possession of an ideal and the habit of critically estimating the value of things by comparison with a theoretic standard. Perfect culture should supply a complete theory of life based on a clear knowledge alike of its possibilities and of its limitations. Well, what Huxley was getting at there is, of course, he wants to argue that if our education only consists of literature and theology classes, that's not a complete enough view of life. However, his argument applies equally well, I think, to the need for STEM students to engage in the liberal arts. I would argue that science classes by themselves will rarely teach students about the limits of scientific knowledge and the potential and possibilities of scientific knowledge. If science students get knowledge of that limitation, it tends not to come from science classes, but it tends to come from classes in history, philosophy, religion, sociology, women and gender studies, literature, art. The list goes on. Right? The list goes on. The critique of the possibilities of science comes from outside of science. I hope you won't think it out of place if I tell you a little bit about my own history with this kind of question. Long ago, very long ago now, I was a sophomore at Ohio State majoring in zoology. And I was bored. I was getting really bored. And I was bored because biology classes seemed to me to be primarily memorizing the names of dead animals pickled in jars. Not terribly thrilling. And friends, there is nothing so dead as a squid that sat in a jar 40 or 50 years in formalin. You're maybe the 100,000th student to kind of peer through the soup and try to see what the professor wants you to see. I found it to be dull stuff. But I got a lucky break. You see, I had some gen ed requirements to take at Ohio State, and I decided to take a class in ethics. I wasn't terribly interested in the topic. After all, I knew I was a good person, and I was 19 years old, so I already knew everything there was to know about ethics. Well, I was in for an education. The class challenged me in ways that other classes had never challenged me before. And the ideas thrilled me. Couldn't get it out of my head. That philosophy class led to another philosophy class, and that one led to more besides. And I came to appreciate and enjoy philosophy. But the magical thing that happened to me through studying philosophy is something I think that's important for all of our STEM majors. And that is, the more I studied philosophy, the more interesting I realized biology was. Biology wasn't about dead things in jars. Biology was about ideas. Lovely ideas, messy ideas, human, contestable ideas that had a history. Ideas that have the potential to change your life. Ideas that have implications for how we live and how we interact with the world around us. I guess I couldn't see that for all the dead things in jars, but I did see it through a more general education. I'm not alone in seeing the arts and humanities as essential parts of educating any prospective STEM professional. I talked to 4 of my colleagues about this topic, and they gave me some great quotes. In the interest of time, I can't read them word for word, but they'll be there in the online version of this talk. I'll summarize them for you. Brian Katz from our math department argues that engagement with the liberal arts helps STEM students realize that knowledge is constructed, and therefore they come back to the STEM discipline with a more mature approach. Jennifer Burnham argues that one critical problem, Jennifer Burnham's in our geography department, one critical problem with scientists is they can't communicate their findings to the general public, right? And hence, the problem she sees is that in spite of a scientific consensus on global climate change, there's widespread public misconception and debate. Greg Domsky from the chemistry department and Joshua Dyer from physics both note that scientific ideas have ethical and social implications. And they both argue that the liberally educated scientist will be the one that doesn't shy away from those implications, that is able to engage those implications in a responsible way and better navigate ethical questions in science. Augustana science faculty get this. We do not see the liberal arts and humanities as an add-on. We don't see it as something that merely adds a little breadth, or worse yet, well, it's a break from the science classes. We don't see it that way at all. We see the liberal arts and humanities as absolutely essential to training STEM professionals. This is not an empty platitude, I hope, but rather it comes from a deep and ready conviction that liberal arts is the best way to train physicians, engineers, and scientists. Thank you.